1923, Detroit Realtors Association wrote into its rule book that if an African American wants to see a house in a white neighborhood, a realtor cannot show it to him. Wasn't there in 22, wasn't there in 21, it's there in 23. All of a sudden, the big downtown banks said if an African American wants to buy a house in a white neighborhood, won't have a mortgage, can't have a mortgage. Insurance company said African American does buy a house in a white neighborhood, we won't insure it. And those big developers, as you mentioned, and there were a lot of big developers because it was a boom town, building all this new housing, particularly on the outskirts of the city. They started to put just a simple clause in the deeds of their houses saying this house can never be sold to a Negro or sometimes to a Jew. And what they did, in other words, is they took those forces of the real estate marketplace, they took this rising tide of racism and they codified it. They organized it. And that's how you segregate a city.
Would you say then that that's what sets Detroit apart from, say, Chicago and the South Side?
Wonderful
New
question.
York and Harlem? Is that what makes Detroit different?
No, that's a wonderful question. Not in the least. What happened in Detroit happened in every major American city in the 1920s. Sometimes it happened earlier. Chicago actually embraced this in the 1910s, particularly the restrictive covenants. That was if you look in Detroit deeds, and you probably have been doing this yourselves. Yeah, I thought I saw you there. Well, I have. If you look in Detroit deeds, there's really almost never have restrictive covenants in the 1910s. It's really in the early 20s, the late teens and early 20s. Chicago's about 10 years earlier. Every city does this. What makes Detroit distinctive, to the extent that it is distinctive, is that it's happening, as we were just talking about, in a boom town. So it's in a place where, what happens to real estate values in a boom town? They go through the roof. And so the stakes of this kind of manipulation of the real estate market are intensely high because people are mortgaged up here because it's the only way you can buy a house in the city. And so Detroit's not distinctive in the process at all. It's distinctive in its intensity of the process.
And in that milieu, in that environment, how did you learn about the story of Dr. Ocean Sweet?
I swear I am going to come up with a good story about that, you know, because it's just, the real story is so boring. Basically, I knew this. I mean, if you grew up in Detroit, at some point or another, there was a chance, I'm not saying everybody did, but growing up, there's a chance you heard about this. It would show up, you know, it would be a 10-year anniversary. It's the 50th anniversary, the 60th anniversary, and some story would show up in the newspapers, or they mentioned it in your Michigan history class, you know, in grade school. Well, that didn't happen too often, at least not in my grade school. But, you know, there was somewhere along the line you stumbled across it. So I knew this story. The only real difference was I didn't know 300 pages of it. And the key was I came to realize lots and lots of people didn't know the story, and I thought it was worth telling.
You tell the story in a narrative fashion, virtually a chronological fashion, and like a good novel, it has an arc, forgive the pun, which ends with the sweet trial, and then, or the trials rather, and then a denouement, which I won't go into, and I'll let you, if you like, read the book to figure out what the twist at the end is. Did you see it that way, as a novelistic form, although it's clearly historical fact, but you tell it more in the style of a storyteller, to be honest?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a two-part answer to that. Yes, I wanted to tell a story. And it was a lesson that I've learned from teaching. I have most of my career as a teacher taught very big classes, especially the undergraduate classes. And if you teach a really big class of freshmen, say at a university, and you get up in front of a class to talk about some big subject, and you don't hook people into that story in the first 5 minutes, you're in big trouble. And that was even before texting came in. And so the idea of telling stories is a way of drawing people into history. We love stories. I love stories. And so storytelling seemed like a very natural way for me to do this. It was a lesson of teaching. I have one other thing I'll tell you. I've never actually told anybody, an audience, this before. I wrote this book for my father. And what I mean by that is my father is a voracious reader. He has always loved to read. And he's a very, very smart man. But my father has his high school diploma. He didn't go to college. And if I had written this in an academic form, he would have had a hard time climbing into the book. And I wanted to write a book that my father wanted to read.
Looking at it now from the vantage point of almost 90 years later, it's hard for us, I think, to understand why it might have motivated Dr. Sweet and his wife, who was, I guess the proper term, within the African-American community, was something of a socialite, something of a social climber.
Oh, yeah.
Using that term pejoratively, but and Dr. Sweet obviously was an educated man. Wilberforce, Howard University, where he got his medical degree. What do you think, now 90 years later, caused him to get up one morning and say, I'm going to move to Garland Avenue in an all-white neighborhood with a Waterworks Improvement Association that is clearly anti-integration, with a police department that is certainly not out there protecting the rights of African Americans, and with the Ku Klux Klan having some 85,000 members in Michigan? What caused him to do that, to the extent that you can speculate on it?
Oh, I think I have a decent sense of that. And it's one of the things that I think makes this story, for me, particularly poignant. I think Dr. Sweet decided to buy that house on Garland Avenue. And I should just, as a quick aside, Garland Avenue sounds very grand. It sounds like they're on some giant boulevard somewhere. Garland Avenue is a side street. It's a tiny little side street. If you're driving down Garland Avenue, you're coming this way and the car's coming this way, you guys are in trouble. Because there's not really room for the two of you to pass, which is why nowadays Garland Avenue is actually a one-way street, but it wasn't in those days. So we're not talking about some really grand, fancy neighborhood. This is a very ordinary neighborhood. They buy the best house on the block. I don't know if this means anything in Lansing, so excuse me if it doesn't, but in Detroit, this is a big deal. They bought the brick house. All right, we're good. So the question, I think, is exactly the one to ask. What made him and Mrs. Sweet buy the house? What made them buy that house were all the things that make people buy houses. They bought that house because it had a nice backyard with a fence around it. And they had a little girl, they had a 2-year-old. And they thought the little girl would be safe playing in the backyard because it's got a nice fence around it. They bought that house because it's kitty corner to a grade school. And so when Eva, the baby, was ready to go to school, she could go to school right across the street. They bought that house. Mrs. Sweet, she says this at one point, I love this. She says, that house had one more room than my mother's house. Dr. Sweet bought that house because he was an incredibly proud man. This was a man who was the son of dirt poor farmers. His parents owned a 1/4 acre of land. Now, I'm not a farmer. I never saw a cow till I was 20. I thought they came in little packages in the grocery store. But even I know a 1/4 acre of land is not a lot of land. His grandparents were born in slavery, and he's a medical doctor. He was a very proud man. This is the great American dream. So he was very proud that he could buy the brick house. And then, by the way, when he moved into that neighborhood, he was of a higher status economically than anyone else in that neighborhood. Because this was a working class, kind of an upper end of the working class neighborhood. They bought that house because if you look at the map in the handout that Michigan Humanities Council did, which is a great map, it's 1 mile, just about 1 mile straight south of her parents' house. Mrs. Sweet grew up in a completely white neighborhood. She's African American, but she grew up in a completely white neighborhood because that system of segregation hadn't been in place yet. Now, house is exactly 1 mile from your parents' house. Why do you do that? Yeah, because they're far enough away they can't just stop by. And they're close enough that when you need a babysitter, you can drop the baby off. In other words, the point really is that they knew that was a risky thing to do. They weren't naive people. But they bought that house for all the reasons human beings buy houses. It was a completely simple human decision, which I think is a really important point. Because what we have a tendency to do when we think about civil rights activists is we tend to, for all the right reasons, put them up on a pedestal. They're not human beings anymore. They are Mrs. Rosa Parks. They are Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, these are great people. I'm not trying to deny that, but they're also human beings. People do things, incredibly brave things sometimes, for the most ordinary of reasons. That's not to take away from their courage. If you ask me, it heightens it. Because all of a sudden, they're not superhuman. They're a lot like us. And I think that's a really exciting thing.
So the Sweets moved in.
Sweets moved in.
Into a very charged atmosphere.
They did.
And it wasn't long before the mob began to gather outside their home. What happened?
They found this house in June of 1925. They made an agreement with the owners to buy the house in June of 1925. They were supposed to move in on the 1st of August, 1925. But Dr. Sweet, as I said, he understood, believe me, he understood, and I'm happy to talk more about that when we come to the discussion part if anyone's interested. He understood this was a very dangerous thing to do. And so what he did in the summer of 1925 is he made arrangements to protect himself when he moved in. The first thing he did was he shifted the move-in date back from that August 1st day to September 8th. And he picked September 8th because that was the day after Labor Day. And those of you who are old enough in the room, you know what happened, used to happen, the day after Labor Day, right?
Still does.
Still does here? Yeah, because Northern Michigan insisted that the tourist trade keep going through Labor Day. Well, in my state, it doesn't happen anymore. Kids go back to school. Why is that important? Because that means they picked the day where they were sure the teenagers were going to be off the street. And he asked for police protection, but the police department was a major center of Ku Klux Klan activity in the 20s. Couldn't trust the police department. So Dr. Sweet arranged his own defense. He had two brothers who were in Detroit that summer. One had moved there, he was a dentist. The other one was going to school down in Ohio and had come up to work for the summer. So he asked his brothers if they would come in with him and his wife to be in the house first couple nights to protect it. They didn't bring in the baby. They left the baby with her parents, because you don't take chances with your baby. They got a group of their friends together, and all together they got 11 African Americans to come into the house first couple nights in case there was trouble. But 11 African Americans sitting in a house, it's nice, but it's not going to really do much. So all through August, what Dr. Sweet did is he gathered together this huge cache of weapons. 10 rifles, pistols, shotguns, hundreds of rounds of ammunition. On move-in day, September 8th, they put them in big bags. They walked right inside the house with them. And they went up the stairs, and I've been in the house, and it's a corner house, which is important. And they put the guns upstairs in the hallway. There's this great built-in linen closet. And they put the guns in there, and they waited for nightfall, and they waited for that mob to come. And it came. About 7:30, 8 o'clock that night, they looked outside. The police were there, out on the sidewalk. And again, it's a really tight neighborhood, so we're not talking really far away to be on the sidewalk. It's not like there's this giant palatial front lawn out there. Police are out on the sidewalk, and the sidewalk from the front door is probably about, I don't know, maybe row 5 out there. And just beyond that, hundreds of white people on two sides, because it's on the corner. And so the men raced upstairs, and they opened up the linen closet, and they took out the guns, and they went to the upstairs window, and they put chairs at the upstairs window, and they sat there with the guns in their laps, and they waited for that mob to attack. And nothing happened. They sat there all evening till sometime around midnight, and I have no clue exactly what happened out on that street, but I got a good guess. About midnight, somebody out in that crowd took a look at his watch and said, "Oh man, I got to go to work in the morning." And they went home. But imagine you were sitting at that upstairs window. And if that mob had charged, they would have been on that front porch in 30 seconds. So you don't just say, "Well, I guess that's over, we'll go to bed too." Just think of how much adrenaline is pumping through your veins at midnight. Mrs. Sweet couldn't sleep at all that night, walked through the house all night. Next day, they tried to act like everything was normal. Dr. Sweet went down to his practice, down in Black Bottom. Mrs. Sweet went out and bought furniture because she had a brand new house with one more room than her mother's house. And she had no furniture. Then about 5:30, 6 o'clock that night, the African Americans, that 11 people, came back into the house one by one for the second night. And Dr. Sweet, he set up one of those folding card tables. He had one of those and he set it up in the dining room. And the men sat around playing cards so they could take their minds off things. And Mrs. Sweet, you know what Mrs. Sweet was doing, right? Of course, she's in the kitchen. She's got 10 people now. She's got to feed them all. She's in the kitchen cooking them dinner. Ham, by the way. And then around 7:30, 8 o'clock, Dr. Sweet's younger brother, Henry, got up from the table and he went over to the front window and he looked out and the mob was back. About the same size as before, maybe bigger. No one's really sure. And so the men go upstairs and they open up that linen closet. It's all happening again. And Dr. Sweet, he reaches in and he grabs a handgun. And he wants to check to make sure that it's loaded. And so while he was checking to see if it was loaded, he realized that his hand was going like this. Because he'd been up half the night and he was tired and he was terrified. So he went into the front bedroom. And I've been in the bedroom, and it's because it's one of those Detroit bungalows, the ceiling slopes down. It's a really small room, and it feels very claustrophobic. And he lay down on the bed to comfort his nerves. Took his shoes off so he wouldn't mess up the sheets. And he lay there about 20 minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then one little thing happened out on the street, and as you saw in the film, the crowd started to throw stones at the house. And they hit on that great Detroit front porch, you know. And it hit on the front porch, and they hit on the ceiling. And two of them, and if you saw the picture of the house, which was taken right after the incident, you can see in the upstairs window, two of them go through the upstairs window. You know what it's like when you hear glass shattering? You just flinch. And the minute that happened, the men inside opened fire. And they hit two members of the mob. One was a young man who had come home from work. He was renting a room at the Dove's house, straight across the street from the Sweets. And he was renting a room, and he had come home from work, and he was up in the bathroom cleaning himself up. He was a plumber's apprentice, so he was cleaning himself up. And if any of you live in kind of city neighborhoods, you'll get this part. So his little boy, the landlord's little boy, comes racing up into the bathroom and says, "They're throwing stones at the Negro's house. You got to see this. You got to see this." And if you're a city person, you know, you got to see this. You always do that. I remember that as a kid. "Oh, look, there's a fire. Let's go watch." So he ran down the stairs and he opened up the front door, comes out on the porch, and he got shot right there. The other man was a man by the name of Leon Briner. He lived down the block. His house was about halfway down the block, but it's a really, really long block. And he had been out on the porch, sitting out on the porch in a rocking chair with his wife, but he couldn't see anything because it was too far away. And so he'd come down the block just to kind of scope things out. And he was standing on the Dove's front yard. He had his back turned to the Sweets house. He was talking with the people out on the porch, including Catherine Dove, the little baby sitting on the front porch. And he got shot once in the back. And it went through him. Went straight through him. And it killed him. Died right there on the Dove's front yard. And that's when the police actually rushed into action. They went inside the Sweets house, as you saw in the film, and they arrested all 11 African Americans. Dr. Sweet, Mrs. Sweet, both brothers, all their friends, and within a day and a half had charged every single one of them with first-degree murder. That's the event that's the center of this book.
My own experience with mobs, and I've only had one, was years ago in Warren when Governor Romney was pushing fair housing.
That would do it.
Circling the courthouse was a mob, frankly. George Romney, being who he was, managed to get out of the car. I was quaking in my boots, and he started shaking hands with them, you know, a foreign politician. But as the night went on...
His son should go into politics.
As the night wore on, I was in and out of the courthouse. I noted one thing. They were getting more and more drunk. Liquor was what was being passed around, either directly or indirectly. Was that a factor? And if it was, how do the police get them out if you've got a mob